Welcome to Cup of Joe and Filthy Pleb Esports. I'm Joe and I'm here to talk about professional gaming. Today I want to discuss a simple question. Is more more? This is in the context of Riot's recent announcement of the new first-person shooter Valorant. Recently, discussion on Twitter and the internet has been whether Valorant can dethrone Counter-Strike Global Offensive and many other FPS in the competitive space today as the dominant shooter. Currently, CSGO is on a high point. They have recently had some of the highest viewership numbers for a smaller tournament that was IEM Katowice. In a few days ago, they were hitting hundreds of thousands of concurrent viewers on Twitch, both in Russian and English, which was just setting records across the globe. So obviously, this a new competitor in the scene challenging Counter-Strike at its high point is something that's going to be of interest to people. So what do we know about Valorant right now? Recently, Valve released a trailer for it regarding with some additional gameplay, so we have some additional information about that as well. Valorant, however, is a competitive first-person shooter with a fast time to kill, similar to Counter-Strike or Rainbow Six Siege. Based on the videos we're seeing, it appears to have something similar to a one-shot headshot mechanic, as well as very, very precise aiming. However, what they add to that classic Counter-Strike or Siege format is hero abilities. These abilities are things like walls of smoke, or the ability to dash, throwing knives, poison grenades, things like that. Every round, the players will need to buy the abilities that they want to use. And similar to Counter-Strike, it appears that these abilities will be lost upon death. So it's very much sort of, you can use the buy one-time uses, and then if you use them, great. If you don't use them, that sucks and you're dead. So it's very similar in Counter-Strike how players buy guns and equipment there as well. Riot is building a lot of hype for this game through the promise of very high tick rate servers and harsh anti-cheat mechanics. This is in what appears to be sort of direct comparison to what Valve has done with Counter-Strike, where generally speaking, since the game went free to play, their people have a big issue with cheaters using wall hacks, aim hacks, spin bots, things like that in the ranked servers there. So that's what it seems to be sort of creating a harsh contrast to. But generally speaking, it sounds great. But so then it's like, will it be rise to the attempt, rise to the challenge, and beat Counter-Strike as this juggernaut first-person shooter? One of the things that people have been talking about is how this game will appeal to Eastern markets and bring in new players to the first-person shooter market, because historically, the Asian regions such as China, South Korea don't really play Western first-person shooters. The focus generally is on MOBAs or very, very specific, like Tencent Chinese only versions of Call of Duty, things like that. That's really what those markets tend to focus on. And so people assume that with the draw of, this very polished, well-designed first-person shooter from a developer people are already fans of, it's really going to upset the apple cart there. And also, if you look at the graphics, they are not quite the same as League of Legends, but are relatively similar. And so it seems to be a trend that that graphic style appears to be a little more popular in Asian markets than, say, something like Dota, which has a much darker palette, harsher tones, and is a little grittier. One of the interesting things, though, is how will that affect Western viewers? Because in countries like Russia, League of Legends isn't popular because they prefer that grittier. I almost said realism there. It's definitely not realistic, but the grittier perspective and palette of a game like Dota, where it's very much sort of, where it's very much dark. It's just that dark tone. They like it more. So potentially, would the graphic style of Valorant be a downside in some of these areas as opposed to a plus side? I mean, presumably the influx of Asian players would offset that turnoff for some Western players, but it's an interesting thing to consider all the same. One of the other things I think that is going to be important for um, when you compare these two games is the ease of watching from a casual perspective. Counter Strike has a very, very low bar- barrier to entry for a viewer, I would say. The gameplay loop is very simple. Get gun, point gun at bad guy, shoot them. Sometimes you plant the bomb, but a lot of time it's all about who shoots who first. It's very, very simplistic. One team is trying to stop the bad guys from getting to a certain place. The other team is trying to get there. It it has that gameplay loop has a lot of nuances, but when you boil it down, it's incredibly simple. And one of the things about that, and one of the things that makes it so simple is that it's clean. There's everything, you know what it does. If a Molotov cocktail is thrown, that creates fire. If a smoke grenade is thrown, that's a cloud of smoke. HE grenade, explosion. You see that the feedback is there very quickly, and it's easily identifiable because again it's based in the real world, so people are able to make connections based on that. And I think that potentially the abilities in Valorant will cloud this formula a little bit. It makes it messier, a little less clear what they do, even if the utility is the same. The fact that it's not, oh, this guy's throwing a grenade, we know what like a smoke grenade, we know what that does, or this guy is using, let's say, a sniper rifle, we know what that does. It's very much the the investment of time and knowledge of the game on behalf of the viewers is going to be higher in Valorant than it would be at a game like Siege. Not quite up to that level of a MOBA, where you need to know what all the items do, what 5 different heroes do on each side, but it's still going to be different and require more from the viewers. So I think that could potentially be a downside of the game as well. I mean, in the gameplay trailer, we saw different, similar abilities, but with different colors to show what they did. Like there's a solid wall that was just one color that didn't, and there was the wall that looked like a poison wall with little smoke bubbles popping up that people could walk through, and but it affected their vision and poisoned them. And those, while it does make it clear, you have to still know what they do ahead of time. It requires that insider knowledge almost of the game, and so it makes it harder for the casual viewer to just pick up and watch. One of the other things I think is that abilities like this, especially with we saw the ultimate that was a channel to resurrect, or a jumping around and throwing knives, things like that. It makes the game harder to balance. And one of the other things that you see in games like League of Legends, Overwatch, Rainbow Six Siege, is that because you have so many heroes whose abilities can interact with each other, and that changes how metas shift as well as how the game is balanced. It makes it harder to balance because of that. And so because of that, I think every time you add a new champion, that's going to affect how the meta is played. Every time you every time maybe a new gun is added, that's going to change how the game is played. And so it makes the game fundamentally more stable and harder to learn, harder to master. I would say that's very different from the take that Valve has taken with a game like Counter Strike, where generally it's small incremental changes. They'll add a little bit here or there to a map to tweak it, make it a little fair for one side, something like that. Really, you don't see a lot of major mistakes that Valve made. There was the R8 Revolver several years ago, where it pretty much broke the game at a competitive level because it destroyed the in-game economy. But besides that, they seem to be it's easier to balance. And one of this comparison between a highly disruptible, complex meta that you're going to have in Valorant versus the very stable Siege meta, which is to some degree has changed, but roughly that game's ebb and flow has stayed relatively the same for about 20 years since, Source, Beyond, and Source and things like that. But This reminds me of a quote that Mark Cuban had when he was asked about investing in esports teams, and he said that he was not going to because the meta changed too often, and that it didn't have lasting because a pro that was good in one patch would be terrible the next patch, between patch and those between to the next patch, and that meta change was fundamentally unstable and made them, in his view, bad investments because of that. So I think that the addition of abilities and just adds to that instability, which in effect could make it a worse esport. Overall, though, I think that while Valorant is an intriguing concept in a game I definitely intend to play when it comes out, I don't think it's going to be the CSGO killer people have talked about, because I think that the appeal, it doesn't have the history, it doesn't have the appeal, and I think that games that are built from the ground up to be esports tend to, they just something doesn't work. They're not as organic as these games that have developed and have created lives of their own over the series of years. What I do think though is that Valorant is going to be an Overwatch killer. It seems to have everything that Overwatch has and more and better. So so we'll have to see, but I think that in the end, Overwatch is probably done, but Counter-Strike will continue on its path. Thank you so much for listening to Cup of Joe on Filthy Pleb Esports. Hope you join us next time.